Alex here with a video on the problem of trust. I released a members only version of this video to get some feedback before publishing it. I wasn't sure that it would be easy to follow, and I'm actually so glad that I did that because I got some good feedback from the members, the channel members, and I also was specifically recommended to watch a video. It's on YouTube, it's free, and it's called The United States of Secrets. It's a two-part documentary. And wow, I mean, the thing about, besides the video being just a great documentary from beginning to end, it's worth every minute of your time to watch it. It couldn't have been more on point with what I was trying to address in the original video before I'd seen this. And so I decided to kind of make it the core of this video, the problem of trust. And I was kind of relying on some current events. I'm going to move those current events sort of to the second part of the video, and I'm just going to, just go through some of the points that were raised in the video from beginning to end. I will mention that Snowden was a big part of the video, but he was not the primary sort of point of the video, and that's one of the travesties, I think, is that everybody knows about Snowden, but nobody knows about the initial whistleblowers, the ones that came before him. And that's probably because of their own doing. So there were actually, if you know anything about the Snowden incident, you'll know that he basically disclosed millions of documents and exposed the government for spying on American citizens in violation of law. And the thing that nobody knows about is there were people that were working within several agencies that were concerned about this, that were actually within the NSA, and there were a lot of allusions to their different forms of whistleblowing. One front and center was specifically charged criminally, and they apparently had major issues, and there was resistance from within the government itself to try and stop what was going on. This is one of the things that I wish ordinary people knew about, is that people think that there isn't any sort of resistance to the corruption, to the violations of law, and there actually is. You just often don't hear about it, and oftentimes the resistance is crushed. And so the public just kind of has this perception that the whole system is rotten, when there actually are people within the system that try and fight, and that they're just not public enough. And oftentimes, in fact, in the video, it specifically interviews these NSA agents, oftentimes, and lawyers too, lawyers that were within and connected to the Justice Department, the Attorney General. Um, People just don't know much about these individuals, and it's not until later, until someone like Edward Snowden just goes nuclear, that people find out anything's going on. And oftentimes that particular individual becomes the figurehead of the issue, which is exactly what happened. In fact, I use the word nuclear, and I do want to mention that the one of the NSA, or one of the whistleblowers slash officials, government officials, actually refers to going to the press as the nuclear option. Like, that's how they see it. Like, they have this culture of resolving things internally, and I understand where it comes from. I mean, with the Our Nevada Judges channel, I kind of see the same thing with the attorneys and generals that are the attorneys and generals, the attorneys and judges. There's just, they're friends with each other, they're colleagues, and they would prefer to resolve things internally rather than expose each other and go to the press. I can understand where that culture comes from. It's just sort of, there's an emphasis on being nice over informing the public on things that should be notified about. And that's another thing that I want to talk about. Is if you watch this documentary, it really reveals how everyone views the press, the government, private companies. They all see the press and the public as an adversary. They see it as sort of us versus them. They see us as their enemy. Whether they deliberately do this or it's just sort of a subconscious thing that they've come to decide, it's hard to say. But that is, in fact, I want to point this out. The point of this video is not really to get everybody on Edward Snowden's side and on the side of I mean, the privacy and all this stuff. That's really the point of the video. The point of, sorry, their video. The point of my video is that I hope you guys will go through this documentary and see the examples of why trust is being eroded in the country and possibly even the world. And the examples that I've mentioned earlier, like that the private and government sector sees the press as an enemy, and the public as an enemy, as an adversary, is just sort of the beginning. I'm going to go through, I have a list of notes here of all sorts of different examples that I hope that you guys key in on when you watch the documentary. So even if you don't necessarily agree with Edward Snowden, and even if you don't necessarily agree with the documentary's confrontation of the government and also private companies violating the public's trust, at least go through the examples and take note of how this sort of conduct or misconduct from private sector and the government, mainly the government, are causing trust to implode. And I'm going to, towards the end of the video, explain the consequences of this and why things are getting so bad. So anyway, the first, let's start from the top. So the first thing that was interesting was the involvement of the big tech companies and also the phone companies. The documentary goes through that, and it explains how their coordination and cooperation with what the NSA was doing actually caused major trust issues with these giant companies themselves. Even today, people talk about how they don't want all their private information being snooped on by these big social media companies. A lot of people have quit Facebook over it. People don't trust people don't trust their own email anymore. There's all these apps that are starting to get launched, like Signal and WhatsApp, that are advocating for, hey, come use our app because we actually will protect your privacy, whereas these other companies don't. So there's major manifestations of the public's loss of trust in big tech. And that's just, even with the cookies thing, the cookie situation and the metadata that's being snooped on, people are even upset about how the ads know exactly what it is they're looking for. So all of that is, it's not directly discussed in the video, but they do discuss in the documentary, but they do discuss their coordination with the government and how that has led to violating the public's trust, and how now these private sort of organizations, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, there's a list of them that were coordinating and cooperating with the government to turn over our private information. It's explaining how that is sort of what's led to this culture of distrust between large swaths of the public and these giant social media companies. One of the things that I do want to point out, sort of in their defense, and the documentary does touch on this slightly, is that the government punishes them for not playing ball. And this isn't something that's mentioned specifically, but I've always my personal thoughts have always been that if you are a humongous company and you don't cooperate with the government, they'll sue you under antitrust. That's just my perspective. That's just my opinion, is that if you play ball and you do what they want, they will let you get as big as you want to get. And if you resist and you try to protect the rights of your clients or your customers, they'll just sue you and say you're too big and it's time to break you up. And then you get embroiled in this litigation. And I can understand why really big companies don't want to fight the government, because they are making so much money hand over fist and they have a lot to lose. And the government has ways to attack them without specifically saying, we're attacking you for fighting for your customers' rights. They'll just say, oh, well, you're too big of a company, we need to break you up. And they won't talk about any of the other stuff. And then they'll exploit the public's distrust of that company to thereby undermine that company's position. It's obvious to me personally that there's huge benefits to gigantic companies doing what the government says because they said so. And I'm not going to pretend that those don't exist. That really just goes to the government's ruthless approach at governing. And this is something that you'll see over and over in the documentary. It's not just the interaction with these big tech companies, but it's the way that the government seems to treat any resistance that they get. It was interesting to see that there was some resistance to the government, to the NSA's, and apparently they use the FBI to serve these. I don't know about that. You guys should double check that. But my understanding was that the NSA would get these court orders from a secret court. It was called a FISA court, FISC, and then they would use the FBI to serve those court orders on CEOs. So they would basically say, you need to turn over this information to me and you're not allowed to talk about it. That was one of the things that was the most alarming to me, is that a judge from a secret court would enter a secret order, and part of the order would be that you need to comply with my order and you can't talk to anybody else about it. Interestingly enough, the order didn't even say in there that except you can talk to lawyers, because I remember the guy actually being really afraid to bring it up to his attorneys. So this is a guy who runs a company in Silicon Valley, and he's like, I don't even know if I can consult an attorney. I think later on they stopped doing that, but from what I saw, this specific CEO was under this order from the NSA that was served upon him by an FBI agent that apparently specifically said in the court order, you need to do what I'm telling you to do and you better not talk to anybody about it. Stuff like that is crazy. It's just crazy stuff that you wouldn't think would be going on in this country. You'd be like, you would think that this is in China or in the Soviet Union or something. Anyway, apparently he did eventually consult with an attorney. I guess it was the ACLU. The ACLU stepped in. The ACLU sued, and they lost. They filed an appeal, and then they lost again in the Court of Appeals. And the government, I'm sorry, I should be clear. The government lost. So then the government appealed. The government lost again in the Court of Appeals. And then rather than take it to the Supreme Court, the government just caved and withdrew the request for the, I love this. The guy he's never at liberty to discuss what it was he was ordered to turn over. They mentioned this in the video. He mentions that he can't say what it was they were looking for, but he can say that if the public knew what it was they were looking for, they would be disturbed. So this is just something that I want to touch on, but it's really not the main point of this video. I mean, let's just keep going. So one of the things that I was talking about earlier was the government's ruthlessness in going after anybody who resists. And this was one of the things that stood out to me as something that I think my viewers on this channel could relate to, especially those of you who are representing yourselves in court, even though it's family court and even though it's family court lawyers, most of you anyway. I think I've talked about this in the video Win at All Costs, and I've talked about the ruthlessness of attorneys and the lengths that they will go to win their cases. One of the things that was brought up in the video was how one of the whistleblowers who was criminally charged, he apparently had a bunch of his documentation seized, and the documents that were seized from his home were not top secret. So the government seized all of the documents, and then they put a line through the part of the document that said it was not top secret, and then underneath it they stamped it top secret. And so after they made it secret after he had been caught with it, and obviously that wasn't going to go anywhere, but it didn't matter. The part of the uncertainty, not knowing how it's going to be dealt with in court, not knowing what's going to happen to you, not knowing if you're going to be going to jail for the rest of your life, and also the duration, it creates this, it sort of paralyzes the resistance. So this specific individual was made an example of, which paralyzed all of the other operatives, because there were several. The other ones weren't charged, but they were all watching, hey, this guy's being made an example of. And so it sort of paralyzes the resistance to what the government is doing, because they're actually seeing this guy who may be locked up for the rest of his life. And then the guy himself can't function because they've taken all of his computers. So he can't do anything with any of his information because his information is gone. He can get a new computer, but he would probably have to start from scratch. And then, of course, his family is falling apart, and everybody's wondering, what the heck did this guy do? So his life is on paralysis. His life is being paralyzed. So even though in the end the government obviously had a BS case and they just dropped all the charges except some misdemeanor charge, something like using a computer without authorization, they got him on a misdemeanor. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that the whole thing was a farce, because the point of the litigation was to paralyze the resistance. And it's not like this is the only time that I've seen anything like this happen. If you look at the documentary on Elizabeth Holmes, the company that she was a billionaire, she founded a company called Theranos. She did the same thing. So whistleblowers from within her company went out to the press just like this guy did. And so she arranged for, they sued the guys, the whistleblowers. At least one of them got sued. The other ones got threatened. I don't know if they also got sued. But it didn't matter. It was a bogus case, because in the end, the case went nowhere. Everything was the guy won. He either won, or they just dropped everything. It didn't matter because it paralyzed the resistance. So all of the other people in Theranos can see, hey, this guy's being made an example of. And then he himself has his life imploding. Apparently, it cost him like $300,000 or $400,000 to defend himself. So even though he wins, he's out all that money. I don't know if he recovered the attorney fees or not, but it doesn't matter because the punishment isn't necessarily the end of the case, losing your case. The punishment is the case. The punishment is the process. They talk about this with anti-SLAPP litigation, is that you'll have the government or rich people that will go after somebody who is bringing an issue to the public, and the point isn't really to win the lawsuit. The point is just to shut the person up and make an example of them. The punishment isn't the end of the lawsuit. The punishment is just the existence of the lawsuit, is subjecting you to the process of the litigation. It's the same thing here, except it's much more terrifying when the government does it, because instead of taking your money, they're trying to take your freedom away. That's what's really terrifying. And so this sort of ruthlessness is something that I'm going to address towards the end of the video, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to talk more about the resistance offered internally and why it doesn't matter, because this is sort of the approach that I think people will see with litigation in general. That if you haven't seen it yet, I'd be surprised. If you're in any kind of litigation, whether it's child custody or not, you'll see these kinds of tactics. So one of the things that jumped out at me was that the executive order that apparently President Bush issued to justify all of this spying on American citizens, it was a secret order, but later on, when people started to get suspicious of the order and started to say, I don't know if this is really legit, if we should do this, rather than go along with it, the government just tried to work around the resistance or find other people that would go along with it. And so first, apparently the Attorney General's office was involved and they signed off on it. Well, when they started to get what do I want to say? When they started to change their mind, that's what I'm going to say. I'm not going to disparage the AG's office. When they started to change their mind, then there was apparently an incident where the main AG ended up in the hospital and then a deputy had to take over. They went to him and he said no, he wasn't going to sign it either. They actually went back to the guy while he was in his hospital bed and said, hey, are you sure you don't want to sign this? And I guess he caused a scene in the hospital room. So finally, neither one of them would sign it. So they go back to the president and he just changes the executive order to take that signature line off and replaces it with his own attorney's signature line. And then later on, that actually gets confronted as well. And I guess there's going to be some major resignations right when Bush is supposed to go through an election, and he gets upset about it because he doesn't know what's going on. And so he gets informed that this is an issue, and he says, okay, fine, I'm just taking this whole executive order away. It's gone. So you would think at that point they would stop. No, well, then they just go to a judge and they ask this judge, hey, can we use this case law from a whole long time, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years ago that isn't really on point? Can we just use this old case law to support what we're doing? So this is sort of the stuff that I really hope you guys key in on, is they win at all costs really does mean win at all costs. The sort of ruthless approach that you see with litigation, with attorneys, with the adversarial process, it's really not just in the court system, it's in politics. And it's not even just in politics, it's in business to business interaction, where there's just this sort of approach of you find some way to win. If you need a person and he doesn't play ball, find another person. If you need that person and they don't play ball, find a different in this case, let's go to a judge and get a judge to sign off on it. If that doesn't work and you get exposed to the media, sue the guy or criminally charge him. It's just this. It's like everyone is everyone's enemy, and this is one of the things that leads to the breakdown of trust in this video that I'm going to talk about way towards the end. The consequences of the breakdown of trust and what's going on. So we've got the let's see here. My next note is you'll also see the government's how they lie. So in the documentary, they talk about how eventually, once exposed, they do have to go out to the press. But they don't see the press as somebody to be candid with. They don't see the public as as somebody that deserves to know what's going on completely. They talk about the absolute bare minimum. So when they've been exposed, they only talk about the portions of the program that have been exposed. And they don't talk about all the other portions that are way worse. And they mainly lie by omission. They leave things out, or they will communicate information in a way that makes things seem a certain way. They call this disinformation or misinformation, where they aren't directly lying, but they're communicating in a way that's making it seem like that this is what the truth is. And if you call them out on it, they could say, well, actually, I didn't lie to you. I didn't say that. I specifically said this. I didn't lie. And it's like, well, hold on a second. That made us think that what was going on was A, B, and C, but in reality, what you were doing was D, E, and F. And you could have said that, but they're treating the public as almost a litigant in a court battle, where they need to win the case, and any tactic and strategy is considered fair game. And so this is really I think what has led to this is fundamentally at the core of why the public is losing trust in the government. And again, I keep saying I'm going to talk about this later on in the video, but I will allude to why I think that this is something that's bleeding into the population's mentality. And it's, I think, why we're seeing people contest elections, and why the public is starting to believe that elections are stolen, and why they don't care even if they aren't stolen. So again, I'm going to hold off on that for a bit. Another thing that I wanted to point out is, I've often said this, that attorneys who are involved in these kinds of tactics, and also politicians, to them it's fun. I think I've talked about this in several videos before, where I say it's not something that they're reluctant to do. It's like a game to them. It's fun to them. And one of the things that is pointed out in the documentary that was exposed, I think this was exposed by Snowden, there was a specific slide where the government was actually bragging about how they had figured out how to break into a telephone building. They created a secret room in that building with no door handle. And on the inside of it, they apparently were splitting fiber optic signals so that they could copy all of the information that was going through all of the telemetry. And one of the things on the slide was they actually pointed out where they were able to exploit this, what they had done to get around SSL, which is a type of internet security. And they actually put a smiley face on it. And so it just shows you that to them it's fun. Like, this isn't something that they're like, oh, we've got to save people's lives. Oh, it's so unfortunate that we have to stop terrorists, and we're doing this reluctantly. It's like a game. And this is one of the reasons why I think people don't understand why things get so bad. It's because they don't understand that the people who get into these positions aren't like ordinary people who are just trying to make a living and have a good life and be good people. To them, they just think very differently. And doing these sorts of things is exciting and fun for them. And I really think that the slide that Edward Snowden revealed shows that this isn't like something where we just have to do this terrible thing because we have no choice. It's amusing. So I've talked about how I will talk a little bit about the government's defense here, because this does actually tie into the problem of the public's ignorance on the legal system, on the complexity of their rights. And one of the things that the government said to defend itself was they feel like they're trapped between a rock and a hard place. They feel like if they don't do enough spying, then something bad will happen and they'll get blamed for it. If they do so much spying that they actually prevent terror attacks, then the government will, like Congress, for example, or the public will complain that they are spying on them too much. So their position is that if we don't spy on you enough, we get blamed for a crisis. If we spy on you too much, we get blamed for spying too much. And I do want to say that I think that this is a nonsense argument, but I can see why this is actually, in a way, true. Because the public is not educated on the details of how privacy and protecting the public works. They understand very basic principles, like you have the right to a trial by jury, you have the right to a free attorney, and you don't have to talk to the police. The public understands these extremely basic legal principles. If you go any further than that, they don't know how any of it works. And so when this guy goes on and says, if we don't spy on you enough and something bad happens, people will get mad at us, he's actually he's actually right, because the public doesn't really see a value in complex legal instruments and mechanisms. And so they see a value in nationalism, loving their country, and hating that terrorists are killing them. They those are things they understand, and so I can see why he doesn't think that he can explain that, well, these some of these attacks are going to get through because you guys have certain rights that are more valuable than these attacks going through. I can see why he feels that people would be willing to give up a whole bunch of their rights if the government actually stops terror attacks. And one of the points that was made in the video was that a lot of times when a lot of this stuff was exposed, the public's reaction wasn't that bad, which is true in my opinion. And that goes to, like I talked about earlier, is the public doesn't really understand these complex issues. In fact, sometimes it seemed to me like the advocates for privacy were really having to communicate to the public in extremely basic, simple to understand ways. Like, they're gathering all your emails, they're listening in on your phone calls, they're gathering all your text messages, and they're getting all of your Skype videos, and that stuff was upsetting people, because people are like, well, hold on a second, why do they need my phone calls and my emails and my text messages? And that wasn't even really a majority of people, but people understood that that was alarming. So talking about these complex legal terms isn't really helpful, because the public just doesn't understand how any of that works. And that goes to the problem of just having no education virtually on how courtrooms operate. I feel like showing people the way that courts operate is really where the rubber meets the road. If you're going to get into legal principles and constitutional principles, it's just like an abstract thing that's floating around in the air. They don't get that. But if you show them a courtroom and you show them a witness testifying and a jury and a decision, and that actually they can get that. They can soak that up like a sponge, because they understand examples. They understand example. Ordinary people, really, the best way to show people what's going on is examples. It just sinks in a whole lot better than if you try and bring up a chalkboard and write things down and explain how things should work. If you show them this is the state of Nevada versus Michael McDonald, they will watch it and they will learn from it. If you try and explain to them the legal principles about that case, they can't relate to that. There's no emotional connection to that. So I get why the things turned out the way that they did. I really do understand why we're ending up in this situation. And a lot of it is just treating the public as an adversary or an enemy, at the same time exploiting the public's ignorance on how the government is supposed to operate. And that's why we're about to get to the point of, let's see, culture of distrust, ruthlessness, which leads to, I think we're about to the current events. So a lot of this goes into the Roe versus Wade decision, and how the public didn't understand that, and how that caused major damage in the public's trust of the judiciary, including the public resorting to protesting at the justices' houses, which is, my understanding, has never happened before ever. And then the thing about the election stealing that's been brought up by Trump and other Republicans, not just Trump. There's many, many Republicans that are using this now, and the public actually believing it, because they don't trust the government. They don't trust these private companies. They don't trust the media. And that, I'll talk about that at the end. And it's like, how can you really confront these arguments that the elections are being stolen if these people that don't trust the elections also don't trust the media, the courts, and the private sector? If you think about it, because there has been confrontation by the media on this issue, saying that the elections have not been stolen, and here's all the reasons. There's been court battle after court battle after court battle after court battle. So many court battles I've lost count, several dozen. And over again, the judiciary says there's not been any election that has been stolen. But it doesn't matter. The people that believe it already decided that they don't trust the courts, and that they don't trust the government, and that they don't trust the media. So these arguments about the election being stolen, I don't think they're going to go away. And there have been some statistics. I can't remember who talked about these statistics. It might have been The Guardian. Something like 40%. It may, if it's not The Guardian, it's some other outlet. Something about how 40% of Americans believe that the election was stolen, and that the numbers haven't changed that much since 2020, which is very disturbing. Because all of these court cases have been resolved, and people still think the elections have been stolen. You guys should think about that, about the consequences of trust being eroded actually open the doors for candidates and other people to exploit the loss of trust, to make claims that it doesn't really matter if they're true or not, because who's gonna confront you to say that it isn't true? These institutions that nobody trusts anyway. So if you're confronted by people that are considered to be liars, they're just going to say, okay, well, these guys are saying that the election wasn't stolen, but they're all liars anyway. So nobody's going to listen to them. So this is going to continue to happen, I think, going forward for several more elections. And you could actually get to a point where an election is stolen and people don't care. That's what's really, really unnerving, is that people are getting to the point where they themselves are becoming ruthless and they don't really trust the government, the media, these companies, but they trust this dude. So some dude says that he's going to, solve all these problems, and they decided that they trust that dude, and they don't really trust any of these other people who are trying to confront them and bring out information to the contrary. And so if somebody like that actually does steal an election, they might think, well, I like him anyway. I'm just gonna allow it to happen. A lot of the times when people are concerned about some kind of radical event occurring, they think, well, there's no way that many people will get so radical that they will actually, go along with something like that. But people don't understand. It only takes a teeny tiny percentage of radical people to really spark a fire. And once it's sparked, the other people who aren't radical, but at the same time kind of agree with them, they will support that radical event. They will support it. Maybe they'll make public statements. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just support it by not resisting, by not fighting against it, by just allowing it to occur. So these huge percentages of people who don't trust in the elections, or they think the election was stolen, these are concerning numbers, because just because they aren't radical and they aren't going to do something radical like the January 6th assault on the Capitol, it doesn't mean that it's still not a troubling thing, because if something radical does occur, that is an indicator of how many people would just go along with it. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was, there's actually a good video by Michael Moore on why he thought Trump was going to win the election. One of the things that he mentions in there was that Trump, I guess, went to some companies in the Rust Belt. I think they call it the Rust Belt. And he talked about how if their jobs were moved overseas, that he was going to impose tariffs or something, and he was going to punish those companies. He's going to go after those companies for doing that. So a lot of people said, hold on, this isn't illegal. You can't do that. Why is the president saying he can do something he can't do? It doesn't matter, because those people are angry and disenfranchised, and they don't care. They don't care if it's not legal. They just want relief. And I think that part of the people not caring about how they get relief, even if it's illegal, goes to the people's ignorance of the legal system. So that was just one thing I wanted to touch on, is the problem of trust is a major, major problem, because what it's doing is it's creating opportunities for people like Trump, which I know he's been called an autocrat before. Autocrat is a scary word that people take as like a character attack, but really all it is this one guy ruling everything. And people associate that with anti-democratic, but at the same time, so many people don't understand how any of the complex parts of the democracy works. And if things get bad enough, they do actually embrace that type of person. A lot of people like democracy for the sake of democracy, the label of it. And like I told you guys earlier, a lot of people understand extremely basic principles like the right to free speech, the trial by jury. I've talked about this stuff. Other things like Second Amendment. People understand freedom of religion, voting. These are extremely, extremely basic principles. But you can still kind of have an autocracy with all that stuff in place. Whether you believe that or not, you can. You can still have voting and have an autocracy in place. That happens in other countries all the time. So to understand, it's a scary word, but really what you have to understand is when the public is ignorant about all of the complex mechanisms of democracy, they're very easily enticed by a single dude that they like. That's a thing that people get. People don't get complex legal mechanisms, but they do get, I like what that guy's saying and I trust him. He's a guy and I trust him and I like him. This is something that I think is going to continue to occur, because all of the distrust, as it continues to get worse and worse, It's going to create more and more opportunities for these types of people to come forward, opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist, especially when the public is disenfranchised. When people are doing well, they're unlikely to really want to rock the boat. But as people start to struggle, when their lives get harder and harder, if they feel like they're not making enough money to handle all the inflation, that all that stuff is, the more discontent and disenfranchised the public gets, the more they start to consider, well, maybe change is a good thing because right now my life isn't going so well. There's nothing really, especially if they have nothing to lose, which there's more and more people that are in that boat now. Um, so I think the last thing that I wanted to touch on is the effect. I don't want to call it an infinite loop. That's what I use in computer science. I think I mentioned that last video. A sort of impossible situation. Let's call it that. That's what I called it last time. If you take a look at police distrust, for example, when I was in my early years, when I was a kid, police were considered heroes and they were on TV shows, movies, stuff like that. And now here I am, all these decades later, and like the police are very unpopular. And how the reason that they got unpopular was because of conduct that was exposed to the public. And I mean, let's just leave it at that for now. And the problem is, the more the conduct caused them to lose popularity, the less applicants they got. And I talked about in the last video how there was a TikTok of an officer comparing what hiring was like, what recruiting was like, police recruiting was like back in the day versus police recruiting now. And how back in the day they had so many applicants, they could be so picky and they could get the best possible officers. But nowadays, there's so few applicants that they had to lower all their standards. And so they got into this impossible situation where the worse the police got, the worse the police got. The worse the public's perception of the police, the worse the new police got. It's a cycle where that they can't get out of. Is they get less and less popular and they get worse and worse candidates, which causes more and more misconduct, which causes them to get less and less popular and thus get worse and worse candidates. And that's, I think, the situation that the government is in right now, where they are so distrusted that nobody believes anything that they're saying. And it's not even just with the election stuff, it's also with like the vaccines, like the COVID vaccines. There was all kinds of drama on that. Now I know I'm generalizing, guys. I'm not saying that nobody, like when I say nobody, I don't mean 0%. I mean that there is a huge chunk of people that don't trust them, and that nobody can really help with it anymore because the private sector itself is distrusted, and people consider a lot of what's coming out on YouTube, Facebook, Google, etc. to be propaganda. And then the media itself is also distrusted. If you think about back in 2016, I think that was when Donald Trump brought up the term fake news. I don't think that's ever been used before. I mean, I've heard people confronting the news, and I've heard of people saying that they're lying or they're not being honest or they don't know what they're talking about. But it's never really been a campaign strategy to do that. It's just kind of been like, I'm pissed off at you, bad media. Donald Trump turned it into a campaign strategy. And ever since then, that term fake news has, continued. They really can't fix the situation either because they also aren't trusted. So I think that that's really at the crux of this video, is that there's this problem of trust that it doesn't seem to be solvable. And if it is solvable, it's going to have to be from some outside source. Like, I have to laugh as I say, Snowden. It's crazy. It's completely nuts to think that actually, I guess they talked about how Snowden was angry with the New York Times because of this. He was actually following the whistleblowers, the ones that I told you I had no clue existed. He was angry at the New York Times for how they handled that situation. The whistleblowers that came before him and all that. Guys, it's bad. And this is a tough video because it's just bad, and more bad, with a problem that appears to be unsolvable, where it's like the government is disenfranchising not only the public at large, but even highly qualified and intelligent individuals within the government. Even elitists within the government itself that are trying to fight for the public are being disenfranchised. It's like the system has become a dog eat dog, everyone is your enemy. Don't trust anyone's motives. Don't collaborate and coordinate with anyone. Um, Win at all costs system, and it's in the government, and it's definitely in the media. I can tell you from my personal experiences that lawyers and news reporters are not all that different, in my opinion. Both sides are highly competitive, do not trust each other, and even within their own internal sort of system. And if they do, it's an us versus them sort of trust. And the private sector really doesn't fit into that category, but what they're doing is going along with things just because it's easier. And so the private sector goes along with the government and the media both. Because if they don't, the media blasts them and they lose money. And if they attack the government or they resist the government blasts them and they lose money. So the only way that the private sector can operate efficiently in their mind is to just appease both sides, to placate them. And so nobody's really fighting any of this, and it's turning into this system now that is getting really, really ugly. And you're going to see more and more of these characters come out that are like, hey, nobody trusts any of these people who could stop me, so I'm going to run for something and try and get power, and then when they confront me, I'm just going to call them all liars. And because the public for the most part believes it, they're getting it further on than ordinarily they would. So I guess the only good thing I can say is you can watch that documentary, because even though it's a little depressing, I think it's fascinating, because the actual NSA agents themselves and some of the lawyers talk. It's not just like a presentation from the perspective of a narrator. You will actually get to hear those agents and those analysts. They go on camera, they interview. It's fascinating for that reason. It's awesome that you get to actually see sort of behind the scenes that people were fighting for you. People were fighting for the public that the public didn't even have a clue existed, with the exception of Edward Snowden, because everybody knows about him. Oh, I wonder if I should talk about that. One of the things that I wanted to mention is this is the culture that the press is the enemy and the public is scary is pervasive within the government in a way that I want to sort of talk about a tiny bit before I wrap this video up. So a lot of the whistleblowers and the agents that were within the government talked about how they really couldn't immediately speak out. Like, they were afraid of their careers being destroyed and of course being prosecuted. And they spoke out all at varying different degrees. Some of them retired, and some of them waited a few years until they felt safe. And all of them were pretty consistent about not being like out in the presence of the public. And in my opinion, that's the thing that Snowden did that was very different. And it might have been because he was naive, because he was just 25, I guess, at the time. And he just didn't really think about it that much. Apparently he was a very principled individual. He just said, this is what I'm going to do because it makes sense. Well, interestingly enough, those whistleblowers kind of ended up being like destroyed. I mean, whether or not they were charged, their lives were forever altered. And Snowden kind of was. I mean, he has to live in Russia now. But at the same time, if he hadn't have done that, I think that Russia would not have given him the asylum status. He ended up making himself such a public figure that it was sort of a political decision for Russia to say, hey, this guy just, poked the U.S. in the eye, and he's super public, and everybody knows about him. And so they were like, okay, we'll just keep you. And because of that, he hasn't served a day in jail, and he hasn't been prosecuted. Now, you still could argue that his life is kind of messed up because he can't go home, which is true. I don't really know how he feels about it, but I did want to point out that this culture of hiding and not becoming too public, it is as much of a benefit as it is a drawback. And I think that the whistleblower specifically himself realizes that now, is that by being a nobody, it was easier to trample all over him because nobody knows who he is. Nobody's paying attention to him. That's just sort of my observation, is that it seems to me that this idea of staying private is a double-edged sword. I mean, yeah, you're private and nobody knows who you are and you're not being talked about, and that may make you feel better, but certainly it makes you a whole lot easier to persecute. A whole lot easier to persecute. If you try and persecute a public figure, the public has an emotional attachment to that figure because they've seen, like, Britney Spears. Perfect example. I've already covered that the guardianship twice, I think, maybe even 3 times. There have probably been 10,000 people who had gone through what Britney Spears had gone through, but nobody knew who any of them were. Of course, it happens to Britney Spears, and she goes public, and the case goes nuclear, and now she's free. So, I mean, this is just something that I hope people notice and think about. So, guys, I really hope that this video was useless to you. If you watch the United States of Secrets, definitely post something down in the comments below. Let me know your opinions on that. I loved the documentary. I love that it was recommended to me, and I'm going to replace the members only video with this video because I feel like this video will be a whole lot easier to follow and is much more valuable because I actually have a point of reference. Remember, even if you don't agree with the central core message of that video, pay close attention to the examples of how the government and the media and the private sector acts, and these examples of misconduct will, I think, be instructive to most of you as to why things are the way that they are today.